Welcome back to Murder in the Black. I have been waiting to say that all week. We are officially in the second part of season 8, and I have missed my interactions with you guys weekly, that routine of talking to you via comments, emails. It has stung a little bit. You know, I love to say that you guys are my MIB fam, so welcome home. Now, MD is away on vacation with her family. She'll join us next week. Let's go ahead and get into our true crime case for today. Our true crime case takes place in Arlington, Texas, which you should be familiar with Arlington because earlier in season 8, I mentioned Arlington, Texas, and a case that took place there in the late 90s where a series of murders happened in an apartment complex. Now, if you're unfamiliar because you're new here on MIB, I'll make sure to include a link for that episode in our show notes, and just in case you want to revisit. But you guys know I'm from Texas, and like a true Texan, I have to represent because everything's bigger and better here. And since Arlington is in the DFW Metroplex and I'm a Dallas native, I have to tell you a little bit about Arlington. Now, Arlington is the second largest city in the Tarrant County area, only second to Fort Worth. And if that still doesn't sound familiar, well, I got a couple of other facts for you. Arlington is the home of America's team. The Dallas Cowboys Stadium is located in Arlington, Texas, and the Texas Rangers are in the Arlington area as well as the ballpark. You should know, and if you don't know, now you do. The more you know. Ding! Shout out to you if you're from Arlington. Grab your coffee if it's the morning, your lemonade if it's the afternoon, but most certainly grab your wine if it's the evening. Either way, let's jump into this case. In 1978, Lisa Rene was born in St. Croix in the Virgin Islands. And just at 16 years old, she decided that she wanted to go to America. Now, she wasn't amongst the first people in her household to decide that she wanted to go to America. Her older sister, Pearl, and her older brothers, Neil and Stanfield, went first. Amongst some of the biggest reasons why people come to America, it's for better opportunities, better jobs, better lifestyle, better education. And those were some of the reasons why her older siblings decided to come. But one of the reasons why she decided to come is she saw the success of her older siblings and decided that she would have the support she needed to lay roots in Arlington, Texas, along with them. And she decided to come for a better education. You see, just at 16 years old, she knew she wanted to become a doctor. Something you may laugh at or snicker at, saying that the Similac was still fresh on her breath. How could she know she wanted to become a doctor? But she was goal-oriented. She knew exactly what she needed to do in order to accomplish her dreams. And she knew that America had the better education, and she wanted to take advantage of that system so she could become a doctor. But don't get it twisted. She was a hardworking student. She had straight A's in her first year in school in Arlington. On September 24th, 1994, a normal evening for Lisa. She was at home apartment that she shared with her sister, Pearl. She was cozying up for the evening, doing some spare studying. And that's when she heard a violent knock on her door. And it wasn't the knock that you and I are accustomed to when a stranger might even come to the door to try to gain entrance to your home or talk to you. It was the type of banging that you can only expect from the police. She was disturbed. She didn't know what to do, and her heart was racing. Knowing that she wasn't expecting anybody, she quickly called her sister Pearl to see if she was. And Pearl was at work that evening. Her older brothers were away in Houston for a music festival, so she knew it wasn't them. As the line trilled for about 2 or 3 rings, she heard her sister's voice, and she asked Pearl, "Are you expecting somebody? There is someone banging on our front door." And Pearl said no, and she gave her strict instructions to not answer the door for anyone. And just as soon as those words escaped her mouth, Lisa heard someone on the other side of the door identify themselves as FBI agents, and her heart began to pace all the more. And once again, Pearl said, "Don't open the door, call 911, I'm on my way home." Lisa hangs up the phone. She calls 911. She speaks to the operator. The operator immediately dispatches Arlington Police Department to her home. But The 911 operator is not done with the phone call as she has to collect all the pertinent information to include in her notes. Once again, Lisa recounts the evening's events, and she said that the men were still at her door banging to try to get inside. No sooner than she finished the story did the 911 operator hear the line go dead. And when I say the line went dead, I don't mean it disconnected. I mean, it went silent for a while, and the 911 operator kept repeating Lisa's name in the phone, but Lisa never responded. She eventually did hear a shrilling scream, and she knew something was wrong, and then the phone disconnected. She immediately called Lisa back, but Lisa did not pick up the phone. Pearl arrived at the apartment, but she couldn't find her sister. Her sister wasn't at the home. And no sooner than she arrived home did the Arlington Police Department arrive as well. Pearl greeted them, and she was distraught. She didn't know where her sister was or where she could have went, and she kept thinking she should have done something. She should have done more to ensure the safety of her baby sister. Now, Arlington PD began to survey what was now the last place that Lisa was seen. It was officially a crime scene. Pearl began to recount the evening events. They noticed that the back sliding door was broken. It was a glass door. And back in the 90s, those sliding doors were very popular. But as we know now, those sliding doors weren't safe. Many people could either break the window or find a way to break the lock to get into sliding glass doors. Now, the police immediately connected the dots, and they believed that when the 911 dispatcher heard dead silence on the phone, that this is when the assailants broke the glass door, and when she heard the scream, that's when they officially kidnapped her. Now, according to Arlington PD, they realized at this point this was a hostile kidnapping. And as they surveyed the room, forensic teams analyzed various evidence found inside of the apartment. One of the first pieces of evidence they wanted to find was fingerprints, but they quickly realized there were no fingerprints on scene, that the assailants who took Lisa, they knew enough to use gloves. So they were still trying to connect as much evidence as possible. Upon further surveillance of the crime scene, that it looked as if other people stayed at this apartment other than Pearl and Lisa. So they asked Pearl, who else stays here? And she mentioned that her older brothers stayed at the apartment because months prior, they had been evicted from their apartment, alleged that they had been selling drugs. And they had a pending drug case against them at the time of Lisa's disappearance. But she also told them that they were away at a music festival in Houston, so they weren't even in town. They begged her to get in contact with her brothers, and eventually she did. She got them on the phone, and she told them that their sister had been abducted. Now, the Arlington PD wanted to know what her brothers knew about their younger sister's abduction. Did they know anybody who would want to abduct her? Did they have anybody in their life who would want to carry out a vengeful plot? And according to the brothers, they said they knew of no one. They were in Houston the whole evening, and they weren't involved in drugs at all. And they had no further information to give investigators. Now, guttural instincts of those investigators revealed that they believed that the brothers weren't being forthcoming. And while they didn't know if they were lying or just omitting certain facts, they felt like they knew more than what they were saying. But they couldn't prove it, and you had to follow the evidence. So upon closing down the crime scene and getting as much evidence as possible, they then went to canvass the area. Witness came forward with pertinent information. They claimed that there were 4 males dressed in camouflage that were hanging around the apartment complex. And they saw those 4 males leave the apartment complex in a champagne Cadillac. Now, this was great information, especially because they didn't have the fingerprints inside of the apartment. Now, the Arlington PD realized they needed to get the Fort Worth FBI involved. And you may be saying, why? Well, there's a certain criteria in order for the FBI to get involved. And this case met that category. One of the things it needed to be a kidnapping of a minor. And because she was 16 years old, they had that. Also, the assailants impersonated FBI agents. By that criteria, it was the FBI's jurisdiction. Arlington PD was no longer the head investigators of this case. But the FBI didn't kick them off the case. They worked in tandem with them to find Lisa. Now, what we all know about missing person cases is that you have to find the person within the first 24 hours. And maybe have to find is a little strong, but they want to find the person within the first 24 to 48 hours because the more time that goes by, say it with me, the less likely you are to find that person alive. And with her being young and vulnerable in her own house to be taken away was more than they could bear. They desperately wanted to find her. He utilized every tool in their arsenal to identify who was responsible. Let's face it, they were off to a pretty rough start. They stayed up all night trying to identify people who were involved, and they just came up with nothing. By the next morning, September 25th, Neil and Stanfield, Lisa's brothers, came forward with information for investigators. They said that they identified the champagne Cadillac that was initially mentioned the night Lisa was taken. And this was very specific information, and maybe information that they didn't reveal. And their suspicions were seemingly confirmed when her brothers came forward with this information, because not only did they find this vehicle, they identified what apartment complex it was located at. And let me tell you something about being in the DFW Metroplex. Almost every major city is about 35 to 45, maybe an hour away, depending on your location in the city. And as I mentioned earlier, Arlington is in Tarrant County, Irving is in Dallas County. That was a good 35 to 45 minutes away. The brothers had to have been looking for this car. They had to have known where to find this car. But they had to reel back in their suspicions and put them in the back seat as they were anxious to go to Irving to identify this car and to see if anyone in the neighborhood knew anything about it. So they reached out to Irving PD to dispatch officers to the location to arrive there first, and then they eventually arrived at this Irving residence. When they got there, they looked inside of this champagne Cadillac to see if there were any signs that Lisa was in the car. They didn't find anything. They knocked on the door to identify who did this champagne Cadillac belong to, and a woman answered the door. It was the early morning of September 25th. They woke this woman up out of her sleep. But when they asked her who did the champagne Cadillac belong to, she said it belonged to both her and her husband. But her husband was working an overnight shift and he had taken one of their other cars. Suspicious of what they were talking about, they revealed more information claiming that they believed that this car was involved in a kidnapping of Lisa Rene in Arlington, Texas. And they asked if she would allow them to come into their home and check. And she obliged. One thing I want you to know about the search that they enacted is it wasn't backed by a search warrant. And the investigators said they typically do not do a thorough search when they're obliged by a citizen to just come in and look, because that's not necessarily backed by probable cause like a search warrant would be. So if ever a case went forward and they did a search where the citizen acquiesced, they could possibly face the court throwing out any evidence they would find because it's not backed by probable cause. You could see why they may not have been as thorough. And I want you to keep this in mind as we continue this story. They searched the residence. They initially went into her children's room. They didn't find anything there, making their way to another room where a young woman was asleep. And they looked in that room underneath the bed in obvious spaces like the closet. They didn't find anything there. And they even made their way up to the attic. Now, they looked in obvious places and not so obvious places, but keep in mind, they're not doing a thorough search where they're pulling things apart, pulling things out as if they would if they had a search warrant that had been executed. Now, knowing that there was nothing significant that showed up, they had to wring their hands and leave the Irving residence without much idea of what took place at this residence or if it was even involved. Detectives and FBI agents were once again behind the clock. Now, they wanted to revisit the brothers because now their suspicions had been confirmed that the brothers were not forthcoming. They knew something, and they started to believe that Lisa's kidnapping was drug related. and it has something to do with her brothers. They reached back out to the brothers and they told them, we know you have pending drug charges. We don't care anything about that, and we don't care anything about anything that you're dealing with currently regarding drugs. We want to find your sister. 3 days later, Neil and Stanfield finally came forward with a story that changed this case forever. According to Neil and Stanfield, on September 21st, they met with two men. One man, they knew him as Steve, but didn't know his last name. And the other man, they had no idea who his name was at all. And they said it was a drug deal. According to conflicting reports, the two men, Steve and his partner, gave Neil and Stanfield anywhere between $4,700 and $5,000 to retrieve 9 pounds of marijuana in exchange for the cash. Neil and Stanfield claim they were supposed to come back within the hour with drugs to give to Steve and his partner, but they never came back because this drug deal that seemingly went wrong was a robbery. They stole from Steve and his partner. Now, I told you about those pending drug charges. Well, they needed to pay for their lawyer, and they used that money to pay for their lawyer, leaving Steve and his partner high and dry. Now, equipped with this new information, they said they had no idea how to get in contact with Steve, but they did know of a person who could give them information regarding Steve. It was a man who was locked up in Tarrant County at the time. They didn't have to do a whole lot to track him down. According to this man, the person that they were looking for was Stephen Beckley. When they conducted a criminal check on Stephen Beckley, nothing came back. His record was clean. He was a law-abiding citizen. But they did discover that he worked in detail at a dealership in Irving, Texas. And they wanted to track him down, but at the moment they were unsuccessful. They now knew that Steve Beckley possibly involved in this kidnapping, or at the very least knew about the kidnapping. They wanted to talk to him. During this time, Pearl, Lisa's sister, worked tirelessly to try to find out information about her sister's kidnapping. She wanted to do something to help the cause. She printed up flyers and posting them in the community. Days later, after reaching no more leads, the detectives came forward and asked for the public's cooperation, revealing details about Lisa's kidnapping. Now, I told you at the beginning of our case that Arlington is the second largest city in Tarrant County. But the truth of the matter is back in the 90s, it wasn't the big city that we know and love today. It was quaint, familiar. And to have a kidnapping occur to a 16-year-old girl was not a crime they were familiar with. And the entire community was on high alert, willing to help out whenever they could. It wasn't until September 27th, someone finally come forward to give investigators more of a lead. It was the owner of that Irving residence that we spoke about before, where the Champagne Cadillac was found. It was the woman's husband. He came forward because he believed he had information that would help them. And he claimed that around September 21st, he threw a barbecue along with his wife for his wife's brothers. His wife's brothers' names were Orlando Hall, who was 23 years old, and Demetrius Hall, who was 19 years old in 1994. They came up from Arkansas to visit, and they threw a barbecue. And it was at this barbecue that he identified that Demetrius and Orlando were hanging out with a man by the name of Stephen Beckley. Now, investigators' ears perked up because they had already been looking to speak with Stephen, but now they were able to connect him to two other men. He also revealed that when he heard the details of the kidnapping of Lisa, he remembered that at that barbecue, all of the men, Demetrius and Orlando Hall and Stephen Beckley, were wearing camouflage clothing, just like they revealed in the news report. He said that he was always very leery of Demetrius and Orlando because they were always involved in drugs in some kind of way. And as a matter of fact, they had served time in Arkansas on a drug-related charge, and he knew they weren't supposed to be in Texas because they were on parole, and it would have been a violation for them to be in Texas. But although he knew they were kind of bad news bears, he went along with it because he was trying to be a good in-law, especially for his wife. But he knew they were up to no good. In addition, he added that his neighbors saw several young men getting out of his champagne Cadillac and mentioned that he and wife went to dinner and there was opportunity for the brothers to take the car since the keys were left in the open. He told them that the Hall brothers were no longer staying at his residence and that the only Hall brother that stayed the night of the kidnapping was Orlando Hall. So investigators start to wonder, was Orlando Hall there when they searched the home in the early morning of September 25th? But they didn't know, and they weren't sure if they could confirm it. He said that Orlando left that next morning and caught a flight to Arkansas, where he claimed he was going to settle down with some friends in El Dorado, Arkansas. As I said previously, once they have names, they then do a criminal background check. They call El Dorado Police Department and they reveal that they're very acquainted with the Hall brothers. They confirmed that they did serve time on a drug charge with the intent to distribute cocaine and possession. They also notified them that Orlando Hall had additional charges in his criminal background for carrying a weapon and aggravated assault. They knew they were dealing with bona fide criminals. They executed a search warrant on the Irving residence to find whatever evidence they could salvage from the home. Equipped with the search warrant, they went through the house, and in the children's room, they came upon something that reminded the FBI agent of what they found at Lisa Rene's apartment. I told you the assailants broke into their apartment via the back sliding doors. Well, they had shards of glass that were everywhere as a result. And when they went into the children's room in the Irving residence, they found a small miniature baseball bat that seemed to have shards of glass on it. One of the agents had a hunch. They said maybe this was used to break down the back sliding door at Lisa Rene's apartment. He didn't know if it was or not, but they grabbed the bat and added it in to evidence to send to the crime lab. In addition, they found a green knit t-shirt. And on that t-shirt, it had remnants of insulation on it, fibers. They also found camouflage pants. They backed that up, collected it into evidence, and they went into the attic and grabbed some insulation from that to test to see if the insulation they found on the green t-shirt was the same. They also did a complete processing of the champagne Cadillac, and they didn't find anything significant to reveal that there was a struggle that took place, but they found shards of glass on the floorboard, and they wondered, was that a remnant of what took place at Lisa Rene's apartment? They gathered all the information up and sent it to the crime lab. While awaiting the results, investigators executed the arrest warrants of Demetrius and Orlando Hall and also Steve Berkeley. Demetrius Hall was eventually taken into custody by the El Dorado Police Department as they found him at his father's home. They also quickly took into custody Stephen Beckley as they found him at his friend's home. Now, when they captured Demetrius, FBI agents in Arlington PD went out to Arkansas to interview him. And Demetrius said he didn't know Lisa and he had no idea what happened to her as far as the kidnapping situation. So he shut down completely. Now, when they interviewed Stephen, he did the same thing initially because the FBI agent was able to produce enough rapport with him that he eventually told his story. One of the things investigators asked him prior to him telling the story was if Lisa was alive or dead and where they could locate her. And he refused to answer this question while he was telling his story. Before I tell you Stephen's side of the story, I want to circle back to what the techs found at the crime lab. They compared the glass fragments to the shards collected at the crime scene and also with the baseball bat. It was found to be consistent with the glass broken at Lisa's apartment. So it was indeed the same glass. They also compared the glass they found in the Cadillac. However, that didn't match to the crime scene glass. And it was found to be from a previously broken window in the Cadillac. Before I tell you Stephen Beckley's story, I want to let you know we're going to zoom in to eventually zoom out. So you'll hear names that you haven't heard yet, but I'll circle back to explain who those individuals were. Now, in the mid-1990s, Orlando Hall and Bruce Webster and Marvin Holloway ran a drug trafficking operation in Arkansas. Now, according to Stephen Beckley, he lived in Irving and he helped that trio to buy marijuana in DFW. Stephen would then transport the drugs to Pine Bluff, Arkansas, where Marvin Holloway would get the drugs and stash them in his house, eventually to distribute. This is where Stephen's story starts. On September 21st of 1994, Orlando flew into Texas for what he believed to be a drug deal. He was picked up by Demetrius and Stephen. Orlando and Stephen then met two drug dealers. Now, this is where we catch up to the story you've already heard. The two drug dealers they meet are Neil and Stanfield, and they gave them about $4,700 to $5,000 to buy the marijuana. We already know this story. However, Neil and Stanfield never returned to hand over the drugs. So Orlando called the two. They claimed that they were robbed and their car had been taken, as well as the drugs and the money. But Orlando was able to track down the number in which he used to gain contact with them in the first place. Now, I want to tell you guys, initially upon hearing this story, I'm like, how was he able to track them down in 1994? But then I remembered we had white pages and yellow pages, and it wasn't so hard to track down somebody or get a general vicinity of where they lived, if indeed they didn't live at a home and they lived in an apartment complex. And I believe this is what he did. If there was another way of tracking somebody in 94, y'all can let me know in the comments. I may be wrong. I'm willing to be. By tracking this phone number, Orlando tracked down the address in Arlington at the apartment complex where they lived. Orlando took Demetrius, Bruce, and Stephen to the address. And that's where he saw Neil and Stanfield leaving an apartment. They were walking to the car which they said was stolen. This is when Orlando realized he had been hoodwinked, bamboozled. He was a victim of theft. And he was stated saying, and I quote, "I'm not going back to Arkansas until I get my money, my drugs, or some blood on my hands." 3 days later, Bruce Webster flew to Texas from Arkansas. Bruce Webster, Orlando, and Demetrius, along with Stephen, returned to the apartment they saw Neil and Stanfield leaving. Now, I talked about Bruce Webster, and although he was a part of that trio that ran the drug trafficking operation there in Arkansas, they flew him in not only to tell him about the stolen goods and money, but they flew him in because he was viewed as an enforcer. He was there to carry out the revenge plot on Lisa's brothers. The group then dressed in camouflage fatigues, brought 2 pistols, a baseball bat, duct tape, and gasoline. According to Stephen, Orlando planned to light the 2 men on fire if he was not able to recover either his drugs or his money. Bruce Webster and Demetrius knocked on the front door, claiming that they were FBI agents. Neil and Stanfield were obviously not there. We know this part of the story. And this is when their plan changed drastically. And they decided to carry out the kidnapping of Lisa Rene. And they didn't have a plan going forward. Everything was done strictly from the hip at this point. Well, the first thing that they decided to do after getting her inside of the car is they were going to take her back to Irving, Texas. But in their route back to Irving, they passed the Arlington police. And it is said that Orlando stated that if he had to be in a shootout with the police in order to carry out revenge, he would do so. That's how hungry he was for revenge. But they simply passed each other. And this wouldn't be the first time that investigators missed an opportunity to catch these violent men. Confronted with this news, police were crushed. They knew that they just missed them. But this seemed to be more by chance. According to Steve, they finally got to the home in Irving Orlando decided that he would stay at the Irving residence, leaving Demetrius, Stephen, and Bruce to head to Arkansas with Lisa. They did switch vehicles, leaving the Champagne Cadillac at the Irving residence and transporting her in Stephen Beckley's Ford Escort. Now, the police are confronted once again with the possibility that when they arrived at the Irving residence on September 25th in the early mornings, that Orlando was there. And crime texts did substantiate that Orlando was there because the fibers of insulation they found on that green knitted shirt matched the insulation found in the attic. And when they arrived on September 25th, he was upstairs in the attic, hiding out inside of the insulation. Another missed opportunity for them to find Lisa. Their souls were completely crushed. But Stephen had more to say. He claimed that on the way to Arkansas, that they viciously raped Lisa on the way. And when they arrived in Arkansas, specifically Pine Bluff, they decided to stop at a motel. Now, this is when Marvin Holloway enters the chat, if you will. Marvin was a part of the trio who ran the drug trafficking in Arkansas. He was made aware of what took place as far as the robbery between Neal and Stanfield. We know that he gave Bruce Webster money for the hotel room. We don't know if he met up with them in Dallas and gave them this money, or he simply was there in Arkansas in Pine Bluff and gave them the money. Either way, we know he had involvement in this kidnapping and was aware of the kidnapping and that this young girl was being held against her will. Now, we'll circle back to Marvin Holloway and his involvement in this case later. When they arrived at the motel in Pine Bluff, Stephen recounted that it was Bruce Webster who got out and registered and paid for the hotel with the money that Marvin Holloway had given him. He claimed that they ended up going to the back of the hotel to Building 513, where they settled in for the night. He claimed that he was then left alone with Lisa. And as we know about assailants' testimony, oftentimes they try to remove themselves as far as they can from what took place during their violent attacks. And so he said while he was left alone in the hotel room with Lisa, that's when he raped her. And he said he stopped when she began crying. But we all know that's BS. Equipped with this new information, they needed to substantiate that Lisa was alive. And once they asked him, was Lisa alive? And if she was dead, where was she? He never answered that question, but they immediately went down to Pine Bluff, Arkansas, to the motel to substantiate the story that he had given them. They also took him with them. They employed an emergency forensic team that was a part of the FBI to go down to Pine Bluff with them to fully analyze this motel room. When they arrived, they were confronted by the hotel representative who admitted that she checked in Bruce Webster into the hotel that night. She claimed that there were two other men in the car, but she didn't recognize them. And she said that there was a woman who got out of the car while Bruce was registering and paying for the hotel. When Bruce saw her get out of the car, he screamed to the other men to get that bitch back in there. And after he paid, they went to room 513. Although the hotel representative told them that 513 had been cleaned several times since the men left, they brought in their emergency response team to tackle the situation that seemed impossible. They also brought Stephen to the room and hoped that he would make a confession. However, he didn't. He only claimed that she had been raped in the hotel room continuously, and when she wasn't, she was being kept in the bathroom with a hood over her head. He also said that on the second night, they were almost caught because a security guard came and checked the room to make sure that everything was okay. But the security guard didn't see Lisa, and he claimed that if the security guard had seen Lisa, they would have killed him as well. But thankfully, he didn't, or maybe not so thankfully. They knew at that point they needed to move on from that particular hotel in Pine Bluff, and they decided to move to another hotel in Pine Bluff at that particular time. The emergency response team was able to substantiate that Lisa was there and she was at least alive at that time. They found a fingerprint that belonged to her. It was on the back wall of the toilet. While they did move her to another hotel location, Stephen claimed that they began to get paranoid and they came up with a plan to get rid of Lisa. Once he identified the additional hotel, they went to the hotel room that was there in Pine Bluff. So we'll call that hotel room number 2. They send the emergency response team out there to collect evidence to substantiate that at least at that particular time she was alive, because once again, Stephen wasn't giving up that information. Stephen claimed that he wouldn't give up any information about if she was alive or dead until Bruce Webster was in their custody. Well, it was almost as if the guides heard him say this, because while the emergency response was at hotel number 2, guess who they saw? They saw Bruce Webster. And he pulled up to the hotel with another woman that wasn't Lisa Rene. So they asked the woman, did she have any involvement? They were able to prove that she had no involvement. They asked Bruce about Lisa. He claimed he didn't know who Lisa was and had nothing to do with her kidnapping. He was very cooperative. He handed over his license and allowed detectives to search his car. Inside of his car, they found marijuana and 2 handguns. So they were able to process him and put him in custody and charge him with those items. Now, I want to circle back to Stephen, because once Stephen realized that Bruce Webster was in custody, he was more comfortable with saying what happened after they arrived at the second hotel, at least. He said at hotel number 2, that they became paranoid. They knew they needed to get rid of her. He claimed that Bruce Webster and Orlando Hall dug a grave that was about 6 feet at a remote park there in Pine Bluff. After they dug that gravesite, they took Lisa out there that same night. However, they couldn't find it. So they brought her back to the hotel, and the next morning, they both went out there again to identify where the grave was and mark it so that they could bring her there that same night of the next day. But this is kind of where our story hits a standstill with Stephen, and I want to revisit who all is in custody at this point. They already had Demetrius, who was caught first, and then Stephen, who was singing like a canary bird. They now had Bruce Webster, and Orlando Hall eventually turned himself in because he knew that it was only a matter of time before law enforcement caught up with him. Now having all 4 suspects in custody, they felt like they could get answers. They were 6 days into her disappearance, and they felt because they kept her alive for so many days after her kidnapping that maybe, just maybe, they could get some answers and bring her home safely. So they go to Bruce Webster again. And Bruce admits that Lisa was dead. He claimed that they returned to the gravesite after seeing it in the daylight, as we're able to substantiate with Stephen's account. He then says Orlando Hall, Stephen Beckley, and himself went out to the park again. He claimed that Demetrius stayed at the hotel to clean up the room. Now, Webster, very much like Stephen, tries to distance himself from the crime. He claims that he wasn't there during the murder. He was only at the car, which was a long distance away from where the grave site was, and that's where he stayed. He said that it was Stephen and Orlando who carried out the murders. And then, as quickly as he reveals it, he stops talking. So a tactic used by law enforcement is to allow people to tell on themselves, take that story, then go back to the other perpetrator and use that against the other perpetrator to ultimately get them to tell on each other. And this is the tactic they use with Webster and Stephen. So they go back to Stephen and they say, are you sure we have the right story? Because according to Bruce, you're the one who murdered Lisa. And he says, I've told the truth since we got here. And he starts to cry. And that's when he states that Lisa was dead. He was buried in the woods. They then get his account. He said that Webster was involved with the murder. He carried it out, as well as the person to dig the 6-foot grave in the first place. He said Orlando helped him. He claimed that they took her out for the second time. He was present. And when she realized that they had dug her grave, she panicked and began to run. They then grab a shovel and attempt to hit her, but the first blow misses her and lands on a tree. Then he claims they hit her again in the back of the head with the shovel and she passes out. Stephen said he was scared because he had never witnessed anything so violent that he ran towards the car, which we've already established was a distance away from the grave site. He claimed that he was going there to be the lookout. When he returned, he said that Orlando and Webster had already begun to bury her, and the deed was done. He claimed the men returned back to the hotel where Demetrius was cleaning up. They took a shower, and they gave their clothes along with Lisa's bloody clothes to Bruce Webster, who burned those clothes in the park. Webster then stayed in Pine Bluff, and the other men went their own separate ways. Detectives, you guessed it, ran back and told Webster of the story. And Bruce Webster was steadfast in saying that he didn't know anything further other than what he mentioned. But one of the FBI agents told him, listen, we have everybody here and everybody's giving their stories. And that's when Bruce turns to them and says, the family flipped. And he said, yeah, they flipped on you. And so it's every man for himself. And that's when Webster tells them again his story, but according to him was the truth. Webster said that he was present during the murder and he dug the grave, and then he offered to show them where the gravesite was. And in the middle of the night, they loaded up Bruce Webster and returned to Pine Bluff to identify the location of Lisa's body. Now, they had to process the entire area where the car was all the way back to where the gravesite was later identified. And this was not a small area. It was a lot of ground to cover. They discovered that the details that both men had given were accurate, especially Stevens. Remember I said the first blow they tried to succumb Lisa hit a tree? Well, they found that tree. It was marked. And they exhumed her body, which was difficult and tedious. This was an emotional case for the FBI agents and Arlington PD. They hoped to find her alive. They hoped that in all the days that these 4 vicious men kept her alive, that they would eventually be able to find her and bring her back to her family. But they didn't. They moved her body to Arkansas State Lab for an autopsy where they discovered ligature marks on her arms, defensive wounds, and lacerations to the back of her head. Her cause of death ultimately was suffocation and blunt force trauma. They believe that they hit her in the back of the head, which left her unconscious but not dead. They then buried her alive. Demetrius Hall turned state witness and accepted a plea bargain of 25 years. Stephen Berkeley did the same and was sentenced to 30 years. Orlando Hall received the death penalty for interstate kidnapping, resulting in the death of a minor, and Bruce Webster was sentenced to the same fate. Now, remember I told you about Marvin Holloway? Well, it's time to circle back to him. He was present at the time and financed the crimes, but did not directly participate in the abuse of Lisa. He was found guilty to being accessory after the fact to kidnapping and interstate transportation in aid of racketeering enterprise. He received a 15-year sentence. Now, I knew that because this case happened in 1994, more than likely we would know the fate of all of these men. Stephen Beckley was released from prison in April of 2020. Demetrius Hall was released from prison in August of 2016. Now, Marvin Holloway eventually was released from prison in May of 2008 for his participation in the crime. What happened to Orlando Hall and Bruce Webster? Well, Orlando Hall was executed by lethal injection on November 19th of 2020, becoming the 8th federal inmate to be put to death that year, according to NBC News. Bruce Webster's death sentence was vacated in 2019 after a judge ruled he was intellectually disabled, and he now serves a life sentence without the possibility of parole, according to AP News. This is the case of Lisa Rene. Now, I'm going to leave the takeaway to you guys, but when you get to the end of this case, I want you to head over to the comments, whether it be Spotify, DMs, or on Instagram, and let us know what you think about this case. Let us know your takeaway. And whoever has the best takeaway or the 5 best takeaways that I receive, I will feature them on next week's episode. So I want to know what you think. I'm not just saying that. I want to give you a shout out next week. But I also want to give you some food for thought about Neil and Stanfield, the people who really set the blaze to cause this firestorm in their sister's life. Now, I mentioned before they had those pending drug charges. Both pled guilty to marijuana possession charges. Neil was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and Stanfield was sentenced to 5 years of probation for those charges. In 2012, was arrested on drug trafficking charges in the U.S. Virgin Islands. In 2013, Neil pled guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to possess with the intent to distribute a controlled substance and 1 count of conspiracy to launder monetary instruments. He was sentenced to 151 months in prison. Neil served his sentence in Dallas and was released February of 2023. When the judge sentenced him to 151 months, he revisited the case of Lisa Rene as he handed down his sentence and remarked that Neil never learned his lesson from participating in drugs and the distribution of drugs via the kidnapping and ultimate murder of his sister. So with that information, tell me your takeaway. Until next time, this is Murder in the Black.